Zoom. There are also some people who will be joining us from YouTube and others in the future at some point. Welcome. Recording. So welcome to everyone. I see that there's some professors here. Welcome. Some colleagues from Santiago, from El Sur, a lot of students, undergraduate and also graduate. It's great to see you. Thank you for being here. All right, so let's get started. All right, so my name is Allison Ramay, and I teach at the Faculty of Letters. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the ongoing seminar series from the Department of Literature. So one of the things that the series allows us to do is to connect with alumni. And this seems important on many levels. One of the things that it allows us to do is to show students, existing students, current students, some of the options that are available to them after they graduate. So in this case, thinking about graduate school in English literature or other related fields. And it also allows us to connect with our community, a community that includes past students, current students, and also professors that are here now and also at other universities. And I think that the pandemic has allowed us to do this, right? To think about our community and how we want to stay connected. So it is such a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. And I'd like to introduce to you Connie Contreras. So she is currently a PhD candidate of English literature at the University of Michigan. She studied Letras Inglesas at our university, and she graduated in 2011. She did her senior research project with Professor Mike Wilson, and she worked closely with Professor Paula Miranda on the poetry event Chile Mira a sus Poetas. I also had the good fortune of working with her. She was my TA and RA, and together with Professor Miranda, we did some really fun things through the Center for Intercultural and Indigenous Studies. Connie is a poet and an illustrator, and her talk today, titled Against a White Background, Latinidad, Indigeneity and Mestizaje from a Hemispheric Lens, is part of her doctoral dissertation, which considers the urgency of thinking about the Americas as a territory connected through intertwined stories of colonialism as well as literary decolonial creations. So before I turn over the microphone to Connie, please just know that you can, we're happy to receive your reactions and your comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll have about 20 minutes or so after Connie speaks to get to those. So welcome home in a sense, Connie. It's super good to see you. And I'm, again, glad that we made this happen, and thanks for accepting the invitation. So the floor is yours, yeah.
Thank you, Allison, for inviting me to give this presentation. And it's so good to be in conversation again with those who kind of started my journey into this thing called poetry and literature. So I'm gonna be reading a little bit of my presentation, and also taking liberty to just talk a little bit free-handed. So as Allison said, we're gonna have a section for questions at the end. I know that there are some professors and maybe even there are some students who might feel more comfortable in terms of accessibility asking questions in Spanish. So of course, Spanglish is my mother tongue. I can also speak in that, speaking Spanish if you guys want to. There will be some words there. And that's just the way I talk. So I'm just gonna start. This is a content warning. A lot of my work stems from my own experience being a white passing Latina Sudaca PhD student in a very, very wide environment at Michigan. So there's a lot of personal anecdote that informs the way in which I understand the theoretical concepts that I'm dealing with here. So I'll just start. I'm going to be sharing my screen just for you to see some like nice pictures in the meantime. So my talk today is called Against a White Background, Latinidad, Indigeneity and Mestizaje from a Hemispheric Lens. And I want to start with this quote by Zora Neale Hurston from an essay that's entitled How It Feels to Be Colored Me. I only understood this famous quote. I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background when I moved to the US Midwest for my PhD. Even though I am what the US racial grammar deems white passing, when people saw me, they saw I wasn't completely white. Never mind you, I studied a lot of years English and I was like super proud of my accent and like all of those things. I was also the grammar geek when I was at Católica, so it was kind of like a sore swap. So there was some brownness, there was a type of brownness that my white peers saw, and if it wasn't in my skin, then surely it was in my sounds. And so when a colleague of mine, a Black trans woman, referred to me as a fellow woman of color, I was just like taken aback, perplexed. Like, where was this color, right? That my Chilean upbringing had so well taught me to mask under the guise of being mestiza. This experience became the center of my scholarly research, and it is from this positionality that I approach my dissertation project, which is one that looks at the concept of race and ethnicity, particularly mestizaje Latinidad, from a hemispheric lens. So for me, what Zora Neale Hurston is telling us here in her words is that racial and ethnic categories are unpinnable. That means that they're categories that cannot be closed categories, right? And they're unpinnable unless, and you cannot see them unless they are defined against a difference. So race and ethnicity are relational aspects of human subjects and of their bodies, and they are most visible when you are in motion or you are in displacement. In other words, when you migrate, for example, or when you find yourself surrounded by people who do not look like you. And in the last 500 years of our continent, these ideas have flooded and structured the way human lives have been governed. They have assigned humanity, and they have even assigned monetary value from the moment of conquest and indigenous genocide through the transatlantic slave trade, all the way into today's neoliberal dispossession and destruction of land and the subsequent displacement and forced migration that entails. Think about the way in which multinational companies own land in parts of especially Central America, and then these people are indigenous people there because of economic circumstances and because of violence that is also related to this neo-colonial exploitation, are forced to migrate towards the north, or even in our case, towards the south. So Latinidad, whiteness, mestizaje, blackness, indigeneity, among many other concepts, are all paradigmatic elements of continental grammars of coloniality, and they interact with each other synchronically and diachronically through specific power dynamics. However, this specificity still results in the erasure of mostly indigenous and Black bodies across the continent. And to understand this phenomenon, we must look beyond the limitations of the nation state. So I have this picture here. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with it, but I'm going to stop sharing a little bit so that you can interact with something more than just an image, and you can see me shaking because I'm nervous as always. So in my dissertation, I explore how Latinidad and Mestizaje serve as analytics in the erasure of Indigenous and Black bodies and their narratives. And I do so by looking at the production of both texts and visual imagery that reflect the ideas of race, indigeneity, and identity belonging. I offer a look into authors from like corners all over the continent, in the Americas, and from like very weird, from like the beginnings of the 20th century all the way into like contemporary times. Because what I want to do is to show how they have, and they, how these authors have, and they continue to have, to negotiate what all of these concepts, indigenous, Latino, mestizo, native, may look, may sound, and what they feel like. And all of this is always done in a non-discrete relational manner across the continent. So using a hemispheric lens to trace these mobile roots allows me to go beyond the artificial limits of what is a settler colonial nation state, like Chile, Argentina, the US, Canada, and we can go deeper into the conversations about like how these colonial enterprises differ one from another. And therefore, they parse out the complicated relationships between Latinidad, Mestizaje, and Indigeneity, because these categories, when they migrate towards the US, confuse the Black and white US taxonomies of race and ethnicity. And all of that sounds super fancy, right? Because those are the perks of academic discourse. You get to use big words. But with everything in life, we only see these things from our own vantage point. And I would certainly, as Allison mentioned, never come to these questions of topics and interests if it hadn't been for like a series of serendipitous steps in my life. One of them being part of SEED with Paula and Allison. But certainly the one that triggered my curiosity the most was a class with Professor Sarah Blair, who is a scholar of American and Jewish visual culture at the University of Michigan, and who asked us in my first seminar in grad school, my first year, to analyze a photograph of my choice. And so I am gonna go back to sharing. That was my choice. Now, I am sure that many of you are familiar with this photograph. I myself have seen it in everything, from my history book in middle school to the guy in the October Revolution who was dressed up as this figure of the Jalajachas, to a keychain that my sister got in this new agey handcraft store in Valparaiso, to postcards, tote bags, murals, all of these sold in hipster stores in Astaria, even to a plush toy, and to little kids in Halloween costumes. And now my task was to read this picture to the class, right? To read this photograph, first with no context, and then to provide some background information that would help situate it. I was surprised when, in another encounter fate, I realized that my university had a first edition publication in the original German of the 2-volume ethnography that the priest Martin Gusinde, a German Jesuit and anthropologist by profession, had written about his travels among the indigenous groups of Tierra del Fuego, the Selknam, the Yamana, and the Gawashkar. And oh my, to my surprise, this edition included a set of plates where this photograph was included. I didn't speak a word of German. I still struggle, but I decided to take it out anyways, try my luck with Google Translator, and ask my German roomie for help, right? What I realized is that there was a lot more than just this one image. This is the work of Martin Gusinde, this German priest and anthropologist who took his camera and in several trips from 1916 to 1919, just traveled around Tierra del Fuego, taking pictures of what would be later described as the last tribes of Tierra del Fuego. There was a whole collection of photographs beyond the mask, faceless icon that we have all seen, which I thought to myself, that's kind of like a very exoticized indigeneity. If you look at the previous picture, right, what you see is a faceless, dressed up character. And that, for some reason, is the image that is most prominent in our culture, like in our visual imagery in Chile. All of these other people, on the other hand, that look like my neighbors, my cousins, like the kids you would see playing near my house in Estación Central. And so why had this previous image become the single narrative of the Sultan people, was my first question. Of the so-called lost tribes of Tierra del Fuego. Why is it that this photograph becomes iconic within our national imagery? A faraway fairy tale mythical figure, exotic and ever present, but at the same time with no humanity beyond its mask. What was this mask, this process of iconization, hiding? And so all of these questions are questions I aim to target in one of my dissertation chapters, actually, by looking at how photography as a tool of empire and colonialism becomes the visual maker of a single narrative of what it means to be human, what it means to be civilized, and therefore what is allowed to exist in the present. And it's really interesting here because the images that you see here, are part of two very salient tropes that you will find in Native American and indigenous writings and studies, which is the vanishing Indian, the idea that indigenous people belong to the past because they have been assimilated, or they have both biologically and culturally assimilated to mainstream culture. Or on the other hand, we have the trope of the noble savage, right? The kind of like new agey, indigenous grandfather that knows like a lot of cool stuff. So what this pictures are showing me here is that there's a lot more than those two narratives, but that at the same time, what goes on in Chile is very similar to what goes on, in other parts of the world when we talk about the photography of indigenous people. The question is why? And I think that it's because nation states are, of course, invested in the single narratives to construct a cohesive national history and story. And what my research shows is that, as always, subaltern subjects, indigenous and Black bodies, individuals, both human and non-human, who are not white enough or who don't conform to a heteronormative, patriarchal, and white supremacist and capitalist, and all of those words, structuring of the self within society are oftentimes sidelined to the margins of history with capital H. They are erased, they're related, and they're reduced to the vanishing Indian, the noble savage, or in this case, the lost tribes of Tierra del Fuego, and caged in pre-modern times, deemed too savage, or even worse, non-existent, gone. So let me start sharing a little bit. So what does this image veil over then in light of all of the things that I've been saying before? Well, that's something I try to explore in much more detail in my dissertation. So if I ever finish it, I'm sure I'm going to have the answer. But spoiler alert, it has a lot to do with genocide and the dispossession of indigenous people. So before I continue, I have to make a caveat. I am very white passing. I have absolutely no claim to any indigenous background, be that by either cultural experience or ancestry. I've had the most privileged upper middle class education you can ever imagine. And although I had classmates from all corners of the world when I was in high school and middle school, I never had an indigenous classmate. But somehow, when I was looking at these pictures, and perhaps also due to the fact that I was in a different country, far away from my family, maybe because of nostalgia, displacement, being thrown against this white background, I felt a lot more at place sitting with these photographs than with my white peers. And what really poked the nerve of the curiosity was that some of these women looked like the only picture I have of my great grandmother. And I'll show you that picture right now. So the woman that you see on the right is my great grandmother on my grandfather's side, on my mother's side. Right?
Connie, we don't see the pictures.
Oh my God, wait. So let's see. There. Now I know. Is that better?
Yeah.
Great. So that woman is my great grandmother. The man that's sitting on next to my grandmother, it's my grandfather, of course, and it's her son. And I have absolutely no proof that there is any connection between claims to indigeneity on my side of the family, but I do know that she comes from the south, that my grandfather was born in Valdivia, and that for some reason I was like, there's some connections. There's something that calls my attention when I look at these photographs. And I really want to know why this unsettles me so. Now, the category that the US had prepared for me one way or another was that of Hispanic. But in racial terms, I could be referred to as brown. Yes, me, brown. I often joke about that because I'm like the whitest of all my sisters. I have 4 sisters. They all tan amazingly, and I look like a lobster. But still, I am referred to as brown. What happened to my skin? I have no idea. I was not white. There were jokes of being pálida, being güerita, but somehow in this US grammar, that's what I was assigned. Now we must understand that a term such as brown is complex and it is also unpinnable, because as always, we are ourselves in relation to something else. And here comes the second caveat. Brownness, just as many other markers of difference, tends to confuse concepts such as race and ethnicity. There is a lot of effort in Latino studies right now, and especially like ethnic studies, trying to separate them, because as humans, we seem to have an obsessive desire to taxonomize everything in order to achieve knowledge. We don't sit well with uncertainty. We like the certainty of exact science, and race and ethnicity, along with language, ability, neurodivergence, gender, sex, have suffered from an unbeatable desire to assign fixed categories. And don't get me wrong, these categories are really useful. For census purposes, for policy, they are fundamental. But in our inflexible faith on their purity, on their efficacy, so to speak, that creates what scholar Thomas Steele calls epistemological violence. It actually has an effect on real people. And as I said before, we do not sit well with uncertainty, even when uncertainty is at the core of exact sciences. And if you ask any physicist, especially anyone who studied quantum physics, they're pretty chill with that sense of uncertainty. Now, I bring this idea about because brownness is a place of uncertainty, and we should be okay dwelling in it. Brownness in the US and in Chile as well, even if you don't think about it, is manifested beyond our epithelial structures, where our melanin works. It is present in our skin, in our sounds, our culture, our education, and it is rendered so through processes of racialization. These processes, of course, are not unique to the US. There's like this amazing study, if you guys want to check it out, done by Marisol de la Cadena and also Deborah Poole, that look at the way in which indigeneity is assigned in the Andes and how it changes and it transforms, making the category like, yo soy indígena, right, versus lo indio. And the one thing that differs is your access to education, being Indio something very negative and being Indígena something that is to be proud of. So these processes, therefore, are not unique to the US. You find it all over the continent. Though in my case, my experience gave me the language to describe them only when I was in the US. So here I want to bring up something that Jonathan Rosa says in his book, which has like the best title ever, called Looking Like a Language and Sounding Like a Race. He says, and I'm going to put a longer thing here, but you have the most important part of the quote there. He says that the ethno-racial status, for example, of Latinx identity is widely debated, as I said before. It's very problematic to imagine Latinx as brown, because brown implies an intermediate phase between blackness and whiteness, right? And that logic is anchored in white supremacist histories of indigenous erasure and anti-blackness, through which some bodies and some groups of people come to be positioned as desirable for their perceived mixed race status and because of their proximity to whiteness. So, you know, like this, there will be people who will call themselves brown and be proud of it, but at the same time, that same discourse is used by the structures of power to basically make like in-group fighting. So thus historical power formations, rather than objectively similar or different bodies, organize processes of phenotypic homogenization and differentiation. These are all really big words, but sit with me with this in this one. There is infinite phenotypic heterogeneity within indigenous, Black, Asian, and white populations. So Latinxes are not a magical cosmic race that will usher in a newly mixed race American future in relation to imagined pasts consisting of a bounded racial category that never were. And if this sounds familiar, it's because this idea of the cosmic race and mestizaje is really at the core of the way in which Latin Americans think about their own ethnicity, right? In different degrees across the continent, of course. Now, regardless, Jonathan Rosa continues and he says, regardless of perceived phenotypic heterogeneity, semiotic ideologies recruit linguistic practices and various signs of difference to homogenize Latinos as racial others. And if you want to put that in like plain English or like plain Spanish, if you have an accent in the US, it doesn't matter how blonde or blue-eyed you are, you'll still be seen as other, right? The moment that you are made to speak, that proximity to whiteness will be unsettled in the eyes of your white peers, or even your like fellow brown peers, so to speak. And on the other hand, if you look brown, you're expected to speak Spanish, right? Now, what we see here, apart from a stubbornly gender process of racialization, is part of the ideological origins of our mestizaje, as I said. Now, I see that I'm already on the mark, kind of, so I don't want us to be like dragged on by my writing. So basically, what I want us to look at is whether or not, and what I'm looking at in my dissertation is how these aspects are relationally connected between the US and the rest of Latin America, right? We also have the same processes of racialization in Chile. And my question is, how do we, or how have certain tools or certain narrative historically been used to establish those processes of racialization as truths, basically, right? How is it that Chilenos become mestizos? No questions asked, right? How does that elide the fact that there is a whole section of our country that is disputed territory? And this phenomena will be found all over Latin America, right? To different degrees. Now, what's interesting, and one of the reasons why I wanted to put these two places in conversation, is that the pictures that you find here are not by Martin Gusinde, but they are by Edward Curtis. And he is like the guy who photographs the quote unquote vanishing Indians. And he created this huge, immense portfolio of what indigenous people look like, because he, in his way of thinking, very much like Martin Gusinde, thought that indigenous people were doomed to perish. And you can see the similarities here. I'm pretty sure you're more familiar with the one on the right, because if that does not scream Leia from Star Wars, then you are missing a very important chunk of your cultural life. So now, one last thing that I want to mention here, right, is that if I have learned anything in the search of writing my dissertation, is that disorientation is good, although it's very emotionally taxing. And here I want to quote Sarah Ahmed. She's a writer of queer phenomenology. And she says that if orientation is about making strange familiar through the extensions of bodies into space, then disorientation occurs when that extension fails. We could say that some spaces extend certain bodies and simply do not leave room for others. And it is that experience that is a very personal, physical, phenomenological experience that then translates into the way in which we position ourselves in terms of our research, right? Now, all of this sounds really cool, but in real terms, it's really difficult to try to put together a project like this because of the way in which the university is actually, composed, at least in the the US University Industrial Complex, right? You have discipline and discursive fields, you have academic cultures and perspectives, right? As I have pointed out here, there were extremely different academic cultures. I came from Letras Inglesas, which is not the same as English literature. English literature is not the same in America as it is in the UK. And at the same time, I was desperately looking for a field of studies that would answer the questions that I had, that would put together everything that I wanted to say. And it took me a very long time to realize that that's supposed to be my job. I'm supposed to put those things together, because all of these disciplines and discursive fields were not talking to each other. Or at least I thought. I had all of these questions, right? And we can talk about them in more detail afterwards. And I thought that no one was talking about it until I came to the concept of critical Latinx indigeneity, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's indigenous Latinx authors trying to talk about this disconnection, disorientation, in a productive point of view, right? And I really like the way in which Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo, that's her whole name, to her friends Josie Portillo, talks about this concept. She says that this is an up and coming field of studies that is more like a drifting between artificial borders. So you recognize that just as nation states have artificial borders, disciplines also have artificial borders. And if you don't talk to each other, it's really difficult to come to something different. And you might be asking yourself, where the H is the literature, right? Because one way or another, I'm in an English program. I can't be just like looking at photography all the time. And I did get this asked by a professor, like, are you really coming here to the University of Michigan to talk about your own country and photographs? And I was like, yes, I guess I am. But where is the literature? Are there authors that are talking about this, referring to this? The answer is yes, and in very different ways. So these are some of the authors that I am working with in my dissertation. If you're familiar with them, it's okay. If not, I'll give you a brief, like, speedlight summary. Valeria Luiselli is a Mexican author that's now based in the US. And she wrote this beautiful memoir, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions about her experience interviewing and helping in a legal aid team undocumented migrants crossing the border and interpreting for them. And it's really interesting because the one person that she finds the most difficult to help, it's a group of sisters, it's two sisters who don't speak Spanish, and nobody there speaks their indigenous language, and they come from Guatemala. On the other hand, in a very different way, we have The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantú, a very controversial guy. They looks very American. But this is a guy who joined Border Patrol, to see and experience the border in a better way because he thought he could help. Now, there are a lot of, in terms of like genre, these are memoirs, and I like looking at them because of how the authors talk about language in relation to their own ethnic concept and how they position themselves. But most of these memoirs do not talk about indigeneity at all. There are other authors, on the other hand, who do. You have here Elizabeth Acevedo, who is a Dominican slam poet champion and now novelist, who I found on YouTube and is amazing. We have Alan Pelaez Lopez, who goes by Migrant Scribble on Instagram and Twitter if you want to follow him. He also writes about his experience as an indigenous Black migrant from Mexico in the US. If you ever have the chance of visiting the public library in Los Angeles, this mural is there and is done by a group of muralists called Tlatlolucos, and it's a name that it's really difficult for me to pronounce because it's Nahuatl. And if you take a look at what it says, that it says Oaxaca, California, because it is like a mural dedicated to all of the Oaxacan community of indigenous migrants that is huge in California, especially in Los Angeles. And to my favorite subject, poetry. There's also, if you guys want to read something really cool, Sabina and Corina is a collection of short stories that really shows you different ways that go against the narratives of the vanishing Indian. We have also my favorite poet, Marjorie Diaz. She's a queer Latina and Mojave American poet. She's a language activist, former professional basketball player, and educator. So she talks about race, ethnicity, and the body and language, is just chef kiss, beautiful. And I want us to sit a little bit with this poem. I think that Allison actually shared with you the poets here, but her first collection of poetry is called When My Brother Was an Aztec. And here she is addressing all the complications of being a Latino indigenous poet in the place called the United States, using her late brother's addiction to meth as her entry point into like this imagery. She talks about her brother's addiction in terms of him believing that he was an Aztec god and that he was sacrificing his his parents, right? Gorging on them, draining color until their eyebrows were whitened. So all throughout her collection of poetry, she refers to the way in which this meth addiction, right, is one of the most, it's basically an Aztec sacrifice, as violent as an Aztec sacrifice. And she goes and looks back into this like very stereotypical way of conceiving in Mexican indigeneity to talk about addiction. And because we don't have that much time, I want us to take a look at this poem, American Arithmetic, from her latest collection of poetry. And it says here, Native Americans make up less than 1% of the population of America, 0.8% of 100%. Oh, mine efficient country. So, I mean, I want to leave time for us to have a conversation. So I want to leave it there. I know that you guys have the poems. If you want to take a look at them, if you have any questions. But yeah, this is my dissertation project, or at least the project rather than the dissertation. So yes.
Great, thank you, Connie. Wow, it's been really interesting. Getting some applaud. So thank you so much for what you shared with us. And yeah, we're happy to receive your questions via the chat or on the microphone if you're interested. I don't know if someone has a question. Catalina Contreras?
Oh, that's my sister.
Oh, hello, Catalina Contreras. Well, I have a question. I'll have many questions. Sure. So I'll just start and then hopefully other people will.
I think Angela also has a question.
Oh, let's go with Angela first then. Go for it.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you so much, Connie. This was amazing. I wrote down so many of the things that you talked about. I understand that your research is trying to highlight Indigenous and Black people from Latin America, and I know that we really need to do that because they have suffered the most after colonization, and they have been erased, which is what you talk about. But I just wanted to know your opinion about like how the term brown also erases the European colonization that we have suffered, and how that whiteness that comes from Europe has affected our identity, and how not talking about that kind of protects the colonizer. So I don't know if you have like any thoughts about that, because I'm doing my research project with Allison, and I focus on that influence. I mean, not European, but like white influence. So yeah, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Sure, thank you for your question. Let me see if I got it right. Because so what I hear is that you're asking how do I interact with brownness, given that brownness also has this like white component, colonizing component, right? That erases indigeneity. And I think that in my research, like I problematize brownness and Latinidad itself. For me, I don't know if maybe it was a little bit confusing because, you know, you can't just like put everything into 30 something minutes because I went over time. But for me, Latinidad and brownness, just as any other racial or ethnic category, are like double-edged swords, right? They can be used in terms of political and cultural advancement, just to reclaim and proclaim that you exist, to have kind of like pride, I guess, especially when you are in the minority. But at the same time, this very same categories can be used in order to elide the complexity of the category itself, right? If we just, which is what happens in the US with the term Latinidad. I argue that Latinidad is just the permutation of mestizaje taking place in the like within the U.S. Racial grammar. Like mestizaje is this idea that we come both from like indigenous and white ancestors, but like always we are resemble, like we have erased that which is indigenous, and then we have accepted European culture and assimilated to it because in terms of like modernity, it's just better. And that's just not true, right? But that's the way in which mestizaje works. Mestizaje has historically been a way of erasing this idea of indigeneity and of difference. When it translates into the U.S. racial grammar, it's a little bit different because racial mixing has a whole different history. But then Latinidad comes up as a response of U.S. census practices that want to say or name Latinx people as Hispanic. And brownness oftentimes comes up because the Latinidad is such a complex racial, Latinidad is an ethnic category, right? It's and Latinos come in all color shades, everything, like all of it. So when you talk about brownness, usually, yes, it has the potential to elide indigeneity. And what you will see in authors that are working from a critical Latinx indigeneity standpoint is how they caution us to always question what these like big categories are doing and who are they taking out of the picture. Now, there is a concept, I think it's by Spivak, if I'm not mistaken, of strategic essentialism, right? When it comes to a very specific struggle, like the brown, like the ethnic struggles of Chicanos during the 70s in the US, for example, that wanted to have their own like Mexican American studies and like a specific spots at university and everything, and their works to be taught and their culture to be taught and their language to be taught. Brownness there becomes this strategic empty signifier around which you organize, right? The most important thing is that we maintain always a critical standpoint of these empty signifiers. So I hope that answers your question. If not, I can always just talk to you because yes, this hypes me up. So
yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much for your answer. Yeah, I just
sure.
I think it's super important to think about this topic because yeah,
I mean,
what I've seen.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially because like when I was growing up, I don't know how it is with Gen Zs now, but I'm a millennial. When I was growing up, everyone talked about their European like uncle, or like my grandfather came from like my great grandfather on my dad's side also came from Italy. According to my mother, the only thing I got from there were my wide hips, but you know. So, but it is something that is present in our culture, especially in Chilean culture. It is different in other more ethnically varied and more indigenous countries. Like if you go to Mexico, if you go to Guatemala, El Salvador, mestizaje is framed differently. And being indigenous it's the degree to which you want to erase and associate yourself to whiteness is different, and the tools and mechanisms through which you do it are different. But it's always that proximity to whiteness that gives you privilege.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Great conversation. Thank you. We have one, Mariana, great that you raised your hand. Thank you. First, we have a comment from Mike Wilson, from Professor Mike Wilson. He says, thanks so much. Great presentation, very compelling. I think it makes us reflect on the issues at hand and perhaps how the paradigm may both clarify and obscure at the same time, especially when we consider a framework rooted primarily from a U.S. academic perspective. The example you use of brownness illustrates this very well. Thank you. Yes. I was having some
It's
similar
very
thoughts.
hard to like kind of like juggle a little bit. I'm writing from and to like an American white, like American audience, right? I mean, an American institution. So there's always a process of translation that I have to be doing, thinking of who I'm talking to, and always like contesting the way in which American academia is always navel gazing.
Nice way to put it.
It's really hard to, it's very frustrating, but it happens everywhere. Like I see that same fight and argument in between, like all of the disciplines that I named before, like they actually have buildings in my university and they like don't talk to each other, and it's hilarious. And because I went to like, I took classes from all of those disciplines, I was just like all the time.
Yeah, and that explains
Chilean professors.
part of the power of your research and the questions that you're asking. Why don't we get to Mariana's question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. This is a very, very insightful presentation, and I want to thank you for bringing all these topics into the conversation, because I think they're all interrelated and they all can be talked about, but I think not enough people are talking about it, as you said. So it's really good that someone is. And I kind of wanted to stop in one of the points you made about the experience of living in a country, English-speaking country, being white, but also speaking Spanish and having an accent. And I wanted to ask you how you kind of related that, if you took a linguistic standpoint, more of a literature research standpoint into language and how it expresses itself, because I think it goes beyond what you look like, but more how you express yourself. So how that like performativity of language was an aspect of your research.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, especially in terms of like the performativity, right? I mean, on a personal, so a small disclosure, for like the 4 years of my undergrad, I was a linguistics student. I love literature, but I was the linguistics girl. I was the grammar girl. And these were questions that I was very much attuned to, even when I was in Chile. Like I've always gravitated, because I went to a very privileged, high school, but I didn't come from a privileged background, so to speak. So I had to like move from Comuna de Maipú a Providencia de la Reina just to go to high school, right? So I had that thing in me that I didn't know how to frame in conceptual terms. Like I knew about intonation. I just studied Hispanicas, so like I didn't know perfectly well like all the terms. But then when I came to the US, right, it was a bit different, because yes, there's a performativity aspect, and I realized that when I speak to my fellow like American white peers and colleagues, I have a different accent. I completely change my accent when I'm in class with people of color and I'm presenting with like fellow migrant students, right? It's completely different, the attitude that I pose. And when I'm in like my Spanish classes, right? Because I also take classes in Spanish, or I used to take, that was just like, I was Chilean. That also has to do because a lot of the people in the Spanish department at the University of Michigan are Chilean, actually. So there are like a lot of internal jokes, but there is a huge component to that. Like, I don't know if you've seen, and it's not only in terms of brownness, as in like Latinidad, it's also in every racial aspect that you will find, an ethnic aspect, you'll find that in the US. I don't know if you've seen, there's this movie where they talk about the white voice. It's like a dark comedy. I don't remember the name. Happy to Serve You, or Please to, something like that. And there's this scene where this Black guy is in a call center and he's like not selling anything. And then this older black guy comes out around and says, you have to put your white voice. That's what you need to do. That's how you gain trust. That's how people believe you. And believe me, that is true. Like, I have a white voice that I can see, and it's just weird. And it's just like very prickly in a strange way. I don't know if that answers your question, but if you, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think everyone can relate to a certain degree, because even in Spanish, we tend to do that. So it's like considering different aspects of our personality into how we express ourselves. And I don't know how that can like translate into indigenous and mestizaje kind of research and readings.
I have definitely found poets that work with that, especially like spoken word poets, right? There's someone that I didn't put there, but there are two poets that I teach in my classes. Melissa Lozada Oliva, she has a collection of poetry called Peluda, right? And she talks about is like her tongue being too peluda, right? And you'll see that in her performances. There's also Ariana Brown. They are also a Mexican Black poet, and they have this beautiful spoken word poem called "To the Girl in My Spanish Class," and it talks about that linguistic performative aspect with all of the trauma and hurt that comes with intergenerational trauma because of colonization, because of racial violence, right? And finally, there's also Denise Froman. She is a New Yorican poet. She's based in Philly, and she has also this spoken word poem that you have to listen to it and you have to see her performing it, because otherwise, like, you will see how she embodies her quote unquote brownness through like the tongue, right? And the movement. It's called Accents. And it's just, yeah. You guys have to like, yeah. Yes. Chef kiss. So
thanks for those suggestions, Connie. So we have a few more questions, and I'd like to ask one too. So Roxana says, it's interesting that you're studying this from the United States, like you're looking at your own world from the outside in. And I wanted to ask a question in relationship to that, just thinking about the fact that you're thinking about what a hemispheric lens means, no? What you can do with it, what you can't, what the challenges are. And I was wondering if there's one concept that, like, between Latinidad, Indigeneity, Mestizaje, brownness, Morenidad, if one of those terms allows you to think about the intersections and, allows you to juxtapose contexts in the most enriching way, And if the answer is no, that's also fine. There isn't just one.
I actually think that there is a concept. And it's Edward Glissant's relationality, the poetics of relation, where he talks about, so Glissant it was part of my thing, but like I ran out of time. So Glissant was a Afro-Caribbean poet who theorized too about the mid-passage, right, the transatlantic slave trade, and the idea of creolization, like he wrote in French, and my French sucks, but like créolisation, which is the Creole composing of everything that happens in the Caribbean, which is just like this influx of different intersections. And he talks about relationality and like and relations and the fact that you cannot. Yes, it is interesting because it's really difficult for me because I'm a very like cuadrada, like I need to have a taxonomy myself. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that I have to sit with this, the uncomfortable feeling that relationality cannot be completely described, and that these are things that just work together. And the way in which I have actually come to realize this is, or sit calmly with it, is through quantum physics. And the principle of relativity, and the idea that every time that you look at something, right, that you look at any phenomenon, this is something that this Italian quantum physicist, his last name is Ravelli, he talks about how when Schrödinger, the guy with the cat in the box, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, he made this thought experiment where he put two cats he put a cat in a box, and he put it with a vial of venom, and the vial of venom was going to open up, and you could not tell whether the cat had died or not unless you open the thing, and if you open the thing, you kill the cat. The thing about that is that he says, well, you can think of the cat, as long as you can open the door and the latch doesn't come off and releases the poison, you can think of the cat as both dead and alive at the same time. And that's the way he explains the principle of particle and wave of an electron within the atom, right? And because if you want to see the electron, if you want to see subatomic particles, you need to put light, as in energy, to see it. So the moment that you gaze upon the electron is the moment that you fix it. So you cannot look at any phenomena, you cannot look at reality outside of your own lens. So you need to always be critically thinking, everything that I look at, right, is something that is being affected by everything that I come with. And I need to sit with that uncertainty and understand that you cannot define things 100%. And that's also what I love about Natalie Diaz, because that is what her poetry is. And that is why I think poetry is more, it's not that I'm a poet, it's just poetry is just a better medium for this than, say, a novel. But novelists fight me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds a lot like Donna Haraway's Partial Perspective, which some of us have read and talked about here.
Oh yeah, I am very much informed by those ideas of new materialism and cyber theory.
So why don't we spend about 3 more minutes? We have a question from Macarena Vargas, an alum from our program here. She was asking about if how difficult it was for you to find a tutor or a guide.
Advisor?
An advisor, yeah, there's the word. And Felipe had a question about thinking about brownness from a European perspective, or European notions of brownness.
So I'm going to go first with the European notions of brownness. I haven't sat to think about that from that perspective. I think that I'm questioning that more and more just because I'm living in Dublin, and because I am my partner is European, but he does not look European. He looks a lot more Latino than I do, actually, because he's half Thai, and the way in which brownness Latinidad specifically figures out here is something that I'm very interested in, but I haven't as of yet reached for the theory. So Felipe, if you have any theorists, throw them this way. Because it is, I feel, a very different experience. The only things that I've read about have been, of course, these Stuart Hall and ideas of hybridity and ideas of diaspora. And that's where I come to this idea of brownness mixing and everything, because of my training as a post-colonial. But current theories, I have not sit with them yet and taken them. I'm actually experiencing them right now. Because everyone listens to what, when I talk here, and oh, you're from the US. Where from? And I'm no, I'm Chilean. So it feels weird to be called out yeah. Sorry, Allison.
No, that's great. No, that's great. And the process of finding an advisor
Okay, so
or advisors, multiple?
so the way in which my university works is that I have to have, for my committee, 4 advisors, right? 3 of them from my department, another one from an outside department. If your work is like very complicated, or it doesn't have like someone who's like specifically working on that, and you would like to invite someone from another university, you can have a 5th advisor, but you always have a chair. And in my case, my chair is Ruby Tapia. She is also a visual culture, an abolitionist. I mean, she's a visual culture scholar and abolitionist. She's amazing. Go look for her work. She's also the best human being I've ever met, especially because she has a lot of patience with me. But the way in which we came to know each other was kind of like serendipitous. Like, she was the person who recruited me, right? She was the person that I had an interview with. She read my application. That year, she was in the committee that selected people. She read my application. She liked it. She suggested I come to the university. Usually when you get your acceptance letters, you get in touch with faculty. They get in touch with you and with some grad students so that they can convince you to choose the university. She called me, we talked, and honestly, she was also the only Latina professor in my faculty, in my department. So, and one thing that I can say for sure is, if that has taught me anything, if you're going to look for an advisor, don't look for the advisor that works with what you work necessarily. That look for the advisor that you have most rapport with. That you like. I got to the university in the middle of like the Trump era. Like, the Trump era just started when I got to there. So ethnic and racial tensions were huge, right? And I needed someone who was on the same page as me. I needed someone with whom I could talk to, because the culture of U.S. universities is very different to the culture that we have in Chile, right? Like the way that I work with Paula, who was my boss in Hispánicas, or the way that I work with Allison is completely different to the way that my classmates and peers work with their advisors as undergrads, right? And I needed something that was more similar to this, and I found it in her. And the way that I look for my other advisors were very similar. Someone that I can be honest with, that I can complain to, someone that's not necessarily that works on my field, but whose work I admire for not only scholarly reasons. And the other thing, always find someone who can keep you on track. That's also an important thing, because my chair, she's not really good at that, but there's another person in my community who's really like, come on, where's the money? So yeah, that's my advice. Just go with your gut. Yeah. Go with someone you could trust as a person. Sometimes the big names, it's not all about the big names. It's more about someone that you can see as a mentor.
Great. Thank you so much, Connie. It's been a really enlightening moment and humbling and insightful, and that we have, lots of reading to do. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone who's here, who participated, who asked questions. And this will be recorded and available somewhere through the Faculty of Letters. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Extension Director, Macarena Arecos, and also to the Coordinator of Communications and Extension, Blenny de Miguel, who made this, allowed this to happen as well. So thanks again for everybody. And I think Connie and I will stay on for a little bit in case people have questions. I think, Connie, you were going to share your email in case people wanted to ask you questions about graduate school. And if you could also send the file that you mentioned, the file that I was able to share with students now of the poems.
Yeah, so I'm just going to put my email there, my institutional email. Very easy. It's like a copycat of my mail usted, because I'm a creative person, but I don't have that much creativity.
I think you send it just to me. I'll send it to everyone.
Oh my God. Okay.
That's all right.
So awesome. The other thing that I wanted to say is, yeah, if you guys want to reach out to me to talk about grad school applications, all of that, you're more than free to do that. If you don't have a paper, or you don't have institutional access to something, and that I may have, feel free. I am known as an internet pirate. So, and yeah, because I know how hard it is to be in Chile and to like get the books. I know how hard it is, and I know how hard it is if you're broke. So just let me know. Those of you who feel like we want to read those poets, I'm like, let me know. So yeah.
Do you want to upload the file there?
Oh yeah, sure.
Are you able to do that?
I am able to do that. Yes, I just have to my computer. I have all the adrenaline already like going down. So.
So as you are uploading the file, there's a question from Professor Susan Foote from Universidad de Concepcion.
Sure.
She says, I'm thinking of Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste, which won the Pulitzer Prize. So power as caste, and how does it all fit together?
Actually, I am listening to that book because I have an Audible subscription, and I realize that it's really hard for me to concentrate if there's not like auditory element to it. So I am in the process of listening to that book because there's like a really amazing conversation that she had on NPR, and that's how I got to that book. It's one of the things that's been a challenge for me is just like two things: start writing from my own positionality about something that I'm not, hard, but also acknowledge the role of Blackness and into everything, especially like, so more and more I'm finding myself bringing in theory that links Blackness and indigeneity and the role of Blackness. I was honestly, as you say in Spanish, like quitándole pompina a la jeringa, because that's a whole other area of research that I am not, not as knowledgeable in, but I have to address it, especially in the times that we're now. So that book has been eye-opening. I'm still trying to find my.
That's fine. I have a question since you're still here, and there's still people. Don't feel pressured to stay. Anybody from World Lit. But great that you're here if you want to be. Because so you used the word disorientation from Ahmed, and I was curious about why you chose that word and not discomfort, or how do you? Yeah.
So so when Ahmed talks about disorientation, she's talking about how she feels the world is like trying to put her in a straight line, because she's talking about her queer identity, right? I think that what I like about the term disorientation is how visceral it feels, rather than
interesting for you. Yeah.
For me, it's like
super interesting.
I think we talked about the fact that so Michigan is like the flattest place in the world. There are no mountains, no sea, no nothing. We're landlocked. There is a huge lake. They call it like the sea. It's not a sea. That's not the ocean. There are no earthquakes. There are no mountains. There is nothing. So for me, it was like a real, and the first time I lived in the US, I was in upstate New York, and in upstate New York, you have the Catskills, right? So it was a bit different, and I was near the Atlantic, still a very disorienting experience. But it's a strange thing to orient yourself through these, entities like mountains, like the Andes. So for me, it is really a physiological, a phenomenological experience that is more than discomfort, because discomfort just doesn't, it's not so bodily, and it does not point towards motion, which is what I like about the concept of disorientation.
Yeah, and I guess in both cases, that's your position, that's where you're coming from, and it really seems to begin with that photograph of your family.
Yeah, that's
the disorientation that happens there.
Yeah, it is. It's also like, so I'm someone who's like very, not obsessed, but like I have my own demons and traumas in terms of like appearance and the body and body dysmorphia. So just everything, even that I write as a poet or that I create as an artist, comes from also that place of discomfort within the body, right? So because I was in a process of dislocation, I really just felt disoriented. And I also like the fact that you can orient yourself differently and you can make that choice.
Okay. Nice.
Okay, I'm trying to look for this thing.
Okay, I won't talk to you. I won't ask you any more questions. But I will say that there are several people in the audience that are thinking about graduate school. So I hope that you will be in touch. And since you have your cameras on, I'm going to mention names, Mariana and Constanza.
Constanza's are going to take the
So
world.
you'll have to be in touch. So I feel like we should probably close. If people are interested in receiving the Word document, why don't they just email you?
Yeah,
sound good?
Please. Just let me know.
Okay.
That's way better.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for being here. And hopefully we continue these conversations inside and outside the classroom.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.